October 7th, 1944. Northern France, 18 miles east of the Belgian border. The morning broke gray and cold over a landscape that had been farmland once, but was now a wasteland of shell craters, burnt-out vehicles, and the skeletal remains of farmhouses reduced to blackened stone and splintered timber. Private James Calloway stood at the edge of what had been an apple orchard, staring across 200 yards of open ground that separated his battalion from the village of St. Marguerite, where German forces had dug in behind fortified positions and were holding a critical crossroads that the Allied advance desperately needed to capture. The ground between looked innocent enough, gently rolling terrain covered with autumn grass and scattered debris, but intelligence reports suggested it was seeded with mines, an invisible barrier designed to shred any infantry assault into bloody fragments before it reached the village walls. Calloway was 20 years old, a combat engineer from rural Kentucky, and he had been thinking about this problem for 3 days with an intensity that kept him awake at night and made his hands shake during morning stand-do. He had grown up on a tobacco farm outside Lexington, the youngest of 5 brothers, in a house where nothing was ever thrown away because money was scarce and every broken tool or worn-out piece of equipment could be repaired, repurposed, or salvaged for parts. His father had been a tenant farmer with a 6th-grade education and hands that could fix anything, from tractor engines to water pumps to the ancient radio that sat on the kitchen shelf and picked up stations from as far away as Chicago on clear nights. Calloway had learned to see potential in objects that others dismiss as junk, to imagine unconventional uses for everyday items, to solve problems with whatever materials were available rather than waiting for proper equipment that might never arrive. When the draft notice came in early 1943, he had reported to Fort Leonard Wood for basic training and been assigned to the Corps of Engineers because his aptitude test showed mechanical inclination, and his farm background suggested he could work with his hands under difficult conditions. The Army had taught him to build bridges, clear obstacles, lay demolition charges, and detect mines using standard-issue equipment. The mine detector was a reliable piece of technology, a metal-sensing device that buzzed when its search coil passed over buried ferrous materials. It worked well on roads and paths where mines were typically planted in predictable patterns, but it was slow, required the operator to move methodically across every square foot of ground, and was nearly useless in areas contaminated with metal debris from previous battles. The field in front of Calloway was littered with shrapnel, spent shell casings, wire fragments, and the rusted pieces of destroyed equipment, all of which would trigger the detector constantly and make it impossible to distinguish actual mines from harmless scrap. Standard doctrine said that engineers should probe suspicious ground with bayonets, carefully inserting the blade at an angle to feel for the resistance of a buried mine casing, but that method was even slower than the detector and exposed the engineer to enemy fire for extended periods while he crawled across open ground. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, had spent 2 days studying the problem. Artillery had pounded the German positions in St. Marguerite, but the defenders were well entrenched and continued to return fire with mortars and machine guns. A frontal assault across the open ground would be suicidal if the field was mined as heavily as intelligence suggested. Morrison had requested tank support to clear a path, but the armor was committed elsewhere, and division headquarters said it would be at least 4 days before any tanks could be spared. He had considered requesting a massive artillery barrage to detonate the mines, but that would require thousands of rounds and might not be effective if the mines were buried deep or covered with protective layers. The staff officers debated flanking maneuvers, but both sides of the village were blocked by terrain features that made movement impractical. Every option seemed to lead to the same conclusion. The battalion would have to cross that field eventually, and men would die when they did. Calloway had volunteered to lead a mine-clearing team, and Morrison had accepted gratefully. But Calloway knew the standard methods would not work here. The field was too contaminated with debris for effective detector use, too exposed for slow probing work, and too large to clear completely before the Germans reinforced their positions or the weather deteriorated further. He needed a different approach, something faster and more adaptable, something that could cover ground quickly while still identifying buried threats. He had been turning the problem over in his mind for 3 days, examining it from every angle, and the answer he kept returning to seemed so absurd that he hesitated to mention it to anyone. The idea had come from a memory of his childhood, a specific afternoon when he was 8 years old and had been walking along a creek bed near his family's farm. He had been dragging a stick behind him, listening to it rattle over the stones, when he noticed that the sound changed depending on what the stick touched. Over smooth river rocks, it made a steady clicking rhythm. Over loose gravel, it produced a higher-pitched scatter of notes. And when it passed over a section where his older brother had buried a jar of collected marbles as a prank, the stick suddenly vibrated differently, the buried jar creating a hollow resonance that his hands could feel through the wood. He had dug up the marbles, much to his brother's annoyance, and spent the rest of that summer experimenting with dragging sticks over different surfaces to hear and feel the variations in vibration. The memory had surfaced 3 nights ago while Calloway lay in his sleeping bag, listening to distant artillery and thinking about buried mines. Mines were metal containers, usually cylindrical or box-shaped, buried 6 to 12 inches below the surface. They disrupted the soil around them, creating density variations and hollow spaces above the trigger mechanism. If something passed over them with enough contact pressure, those variations might produce detectable vibrations, different from the sound and feel of solid, undisturbed ground. It would be subtle, probably imperceptible to bare hands, but if the dragging object made noise, if it rattled or clinked naturally, then the change in vibration might alter that sound in a way that human ears could detect. Calloway had walked to the supply dump and looked for materials. The engineers kept stocks of wire, sandbags, wooden stakes, and various metal components for construction projects. What he needed was something that would make noise when dragged over ground, something light enough to respond to subtle changes in terrain, but heavy enough to maintain contact. He found a crate of empty tin cans, ration containers that had been opened and discarded, waiting to be buried or hauled away. He collected 20 cans, punched holes in the bottoms with a screwdriver, and threaded them onto a length of communication wire, spacing them 6 inches apart, so they would clank against each other when pulled. The result looked like a ridiculous piece of junk, the kind of noisemaker that children might drag behind a bicycle. He tested it by pulling across a patch of ground near the camp and listening to the rattling symphony it produced, a chaotic music of metal on earth that changed pitch and rhythm depending on whether he crossed dirt, gravel, grass, or debris. He knew immediately that this was either brilliant or insane, and he was not sure which. The concept was sound. The cans would amplify vibrations from the ground beneath them, and changes in those vibrations might reveal buried objects. But the execution seemed childish, improvised, the desperate invention of someone who had run out of legitimate options. If he presented this to Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, the commander might laugh him out of the tent or assign him to rear echelon duties for wasting time on foolish experiments. If he showed it to the other engineers, men who had been trained on proper equipment and followed doctrine religiously, they would mock him and question his competence. But the alternative was watching men die in a minefield because conventional methods were too slow and the Army's equipment was inadequate for contaminated ground. He decided to test it properly before showing anyone. The following night, he snuck away from the camp and walked to an area behind the lines where the engineers had set up a training field with dummy mines, inert practice devices buried in known locations to teach new soldiers how to detect and disarm them. The field had not been used in weeks, and the markers showing mine locations had been removed or lost. Calloway tied a string of cans to his belt and began walking slowly across the field, dragging the improvised device behind him. For the first 20 yards, the cans produced a steady clattering noise, irregular but consistent, metal bouncing over dirt and grass. Then the sound changed, becoming sharper, more resonant, as if the cans were passing over something hollow. He stopped, marked the spot with a stick, and continued. 3 yards later, another change, another marker. He covered the entire field in half an hour, marking 7 locations where the can noise had shifted noticeably. When he finished, he borrowed a mine detector and swept the areas he had marked. 5 of the 7 were genuine mine locations, confirmed by the detector's buzz and careful probing with a bayonet. The other 2 were false positives, old tree roots that created hollow spaces similar to mine cavities. A 70% accuracy rate, achieved in a fraction of the time it would have taken to sweep the entire field with standard equipment. Calloway stared at a string of tin cans and felt something close to awe mixed with disbelief. It worked. The absurd, childish contraption actually worked. The next morning, he requested a meeting with a battalion engineer officer, Captain Drummond, a West Point graduate who believed in procedure, protocol, and the superiority of properly designed military equipment over improvised solutions. Calloway brought his tin can device and explained the theory and the test results. Drummond listened with an expression that shifted from curiosity to skepticism to barely concealed contempt. When Calloway finished, Drummond said, "You want to clear a minefield by dragging garbage behind you and listening for rattles?" Calloway nodded. Drummond shook his head. "Private, the Army issues mine detectors because they work. Your little experiment might have gotten lucky, but luck isn't a method. We'll clear that field the proper way, with detectors and probe teams, and we'll do it when a battalion is ready to assault." Dismissed. Calloway saluted and left, but the dismissal burned in his chest. He knew the proper way would take too long, expose too many men, and probably fail because of the debris contamination. He also knew that arguing with the captain was a fast way to end up on latrine duty, or worse. But he could not let go of the idea that his tin cans might save lives if someone would just give them a chance. That afternoon, he approached Sergeant Holland, the senior NCO in the engineer platoon, a 38-year-old former construction foreman from Pittsburgh who had survived North Africa, Sicily, and Normandy by trusting his instincts more than officers' theories. Holland listened to Calloway's explanation, examined the tin can device, and said, "Show me." They walked to the training field together, and Calloway repeated his demonstration, dragging the cans across the ground and stopping when the sound changed. Holland followed with a mine detector, confirming the locations. After the fifth successful detection, Holland said, "This is the craziest thing I've seen since a guy in Sicily tried to use a flamethrower to cook rations. But it works." He looked at Calloway. "Morrison wants that field cleared tomorrow morning. Drummond's going to send a standard probe team, and they'll be out there for hours, perfect targets for German snipers. If you really believe your tin cans are better, you need to prove it to Morrison directly, tonight, before Drummond finalizes his plan." That evening, Calloway waited outside the battalion command post until Lieutenant Colonel Morrison emerged for a cigarette break. Calloway saluted and said, "Sir, I have an alternative method for clearing the minefield that's faster and safer than standard procedures." Morrison looked at him with tired eyes. "I've got 3 staff officers in there telling me this assault is going to cost 200 casualties minimum. Unless your alternative involves magic, I'm not interested." Calloway held up the string of tin cans. "It involves these, sir." Morrison stared at the cans, then at Calloway. "Is this a joke, Private?" Calloway met his eyes. "No, sir. I've tested it on known mine locations. It has a 70% detection rate and covers ground 10 times faster than probe teams." Morrison took a long drag on his cigarette. "Captain Drummond know about this?" Calloway nodded. "He disapproved it, sir." Morrison smiled grimly. "Of course he did. Drummond thinks the Army manual is holy scripture." He dropped the cigarette and ground it under his boot. "You got 5 minutes to convince me this isn't the dumbest thing I've ever seen. Start talking." Calloway explained the physics of vibration detection, the childhood memory that had inspired the idea, the successful test results, the advantages over conventional methods in debris-contaminated environments. Morrison listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When Calloway finished, Morrison said, "If I let you try this and it fails, men will walk into mines because they trusted your tin cans instead of proper equipment. That's on you. If it works, Drummond will never forgive you for making him look like a fool. That's also on you. You understand?" Calloway nodded. Morrison sighed. "You'll lead the clearing operation at 0500 tomorrow. You'll have 2 hours to identify a safe path wide enough for a company to advance. If you succeed, the assault goes forward. If you fail, we wait for tanks and Drummond gets to say he was right. Don't make me regret this." Calloway barely slept that night. He lay in his tent, running through every possible failure mode, imagining the cans missing a mine and men dying because he convinced the commander to trust his stupid idea. But he also remembered the sound of the cans changing pitch over buried training mines, the consistent pattern that had emerged from what seemed like random noise, and he believed, with a faith that defied military logic, that the method would work in the real field as it had in the test. At 0430, he stood at the edge of the contested field with Sergeant Holland. Two other engineers named Rodriguez and Patterson, and a medical corpsman named Fisher who had volunteered to accompany them in case someone triggered a mine. The October darkness was absolute. No moon and heavy cloud cover that swallowed starlight. Calloway could barely see the outline of the field, just a void of lesser blackness against the black sky. He tied the string of tin cans to his belt, checked that each can was secure and properly spaced, and took a deep breath. Holland handed him a flashlight with a red filter. You'll need this to mark the mines once you find them. Stay low, move slow, and if you hear anything that doesn't sound right, stop immediately. Calloway nodded, his throat too tight to speak. At 0500, he stepped onto the field. The grass was wet with dew, and the ground felt soft beneath his boots, yielding slightly with each step. He began walking forward in a straight line, the tin cans dragging behind him with a muted clatter that seemed impossibly loud in the pre-dawn silence. Behind him, Holland and the others followed at a safe distance, marking the path with engineer tape so that the assault troops would know where to step. Calloway focused on the sound of the cans, the irregular percussion of metal scraping over earth and vegetation, listening for any shift in tone or rhythm that might indicate a buried object. For the first 30 yards, nothing changed. The cans rattled steadily, a baseline sound that Calloway memorized in his mind. Then, at 35 yards, the noise sharpened, becoming more resonant, almost bell-like. He stopped immediately and raised his hand. Holland came forward with a mine detector and swept the area. The detector buzzed. Holland knelt and probed carefully with a bayonet, feeling the resistance of a metal casing 8 inches below the surface. He marked the location with a small flag and motioned for Calloway to continue. Calloway adjusted his path slightly to avoid the mine and kept walking. At 50 yards, another change in the can rattle. Another mine. At 63 yards, a third. The field was revealing itself through sound, a hidden apology of buried death that conventional equipment would have struggled to map. Calloway felt sweat running down his back despite the cold air. His nerves wound so tight he could feel his pulse in his temples. Behind him, the engineer team marked each mine location with flags, creating a visual record of the safe path. At 80 yards, the Germans in St. Marguerite realized that something was happening in the field. A flare shot into the sky, burst into brilliant white light that turned night into day and exposed Calloway standing in the middle of the open ground with a ridiculous string of tin cans trailing behind him. For one frozen moment, he was perfectly visible, a lone figure in a wasteland, holding a device that looked like a child's toy. Then machine gun fire erupted from the village, bullets snapping through the air around him. He dropped flat, pressing his face into the wet grass, feeling round crack overhead and impact the ground with soft thuds. The flare drifted down on its parachute, casting swaying shadows that made the shell craters look like open graves. Holland and the others hit the ground as well, cursing and crawling toward whatever cover they could find. The machine gun fire continued for 30 seconds, then stopped as the flare burned out and darkness returned. Calloway lay motionless, breathing hard, waiting to see if another flare would follow. Silence. He heard Sergeant Holland's voice, low and urgent. "Calloway, you hit?" Calloway checked himself quickly. "Negative. I'm okay." Holland crawled forward until he was beside Calloway. "We need to finish this before they get organized. Can you keep going?" Calloway nodded, though his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the flashlight. He stood up, ignoring the possibility of sniper fire, and continued across the field. The cans rattled behind him, and he forced himself to focus on the sound, blocking out fear and the knowledge that he was completely exposed. At 90 yards, another mine. At 110, 2 more in close proximity, probably part of a defensive cluster. At 130 yards, the sound changed dramatically, becoming almost musical, a rapid-fire staccato that suggested multiple buried objects in a tight pattern. Holland swept the area and confirmed a dense minefield, 8 devices within a 10-yard radius, a killing zone designed to annihilate any infantry unit that reached this point. Calloway marked the boundary and led his team around the cluster, angling toward the left flank where the can noise remained consistent. The sky was beginning to lighten, gray dawn filtering through the clouds. Calloway glanced back and saw the engineer tape marking the path he had cleared, a winding trail for the minefield that the assault company could follow safely. He had covered 160 yards in 90 minutes, faster than any probe team could have managed, and he had marked 23 mines plus the dense cluster. The battalion had a path. At 180 yards, Calloway heard the cannons rattle differently again, but this time the sound was wrong, too sharp and metallic, not the hollow resonance of a buried mine. He stopped and knelt, examining the ground. Rodriguez came forward with a detector and swept the area. Nothing. Calloway frowned, confused. The can noise had definitely changed, but there was no mine. He scraped at the dirt with his bayonet and uncovered a length of metal wire, nearly buried, running perpendicular to his path. He followed the wire with his eyes and saw it disappear into the grass on both sides. Tripwire connected to something. He traced it carefully and found a cluster of stick grenades bundled together and buried in a shallow hole, a booby trap designed to detonate when someone snagged the wire. Holland came forward and examined the setup. Your cans just found something the detector wouldn't have caught. Tripwires don't set off metal detectors unless you're right on top of them. He disabled the grenades and marked the location. Calloway felt a surge of indication mixed with terror. The tin cans were detecting not just mines, but also variations in ground density and hidden wires, anything that changed the vibration pattern. The method was even more effective than he had hoped. By 0630, Calloway had reached the far edge of the field, 195 yards from the starting point. Behind him, the marked path snaked through the minefield, bypassing 29 confirmed mines, 1 dense cluster and 3 booby traps. The battalion had a corridor approximately 8 feet wide, narrow but sufficient for infantry to advance in single file. Calloway signaled to Sergeant Holland that the clearing was complete, then collapsed onto grass, exhausted and shaking with adrenaline come down. Holland clapped him on the shoulder. You just did something no one's going to believe. When Captain Drummond sees this, he's either going to recommend you for a medal or have you court-martialed for making him look incompetent. At 0700, the assault company moved forward, following the taped path through the minefield. Calloway watched from the far edge as 200 men crossed the field in 20 minutes, every one of them reaching the other side safely. Not a single mine detonated, not a single casualty. The company formed up at the edge of the village and assaulted the German positions with covering fire from mortars and machine guns. The defenders, already demoralized by days of artillery bombardment and surprised by the speed of the American advance, fell back to secondary positions. By 0900, St. Marguerite was in Allied hands, and the critical crossroads was secured. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison found Calloway sitting against a stone wall, still holding a string of tin cans. Morrison looked at the device, then at Calloway, and shook his head slowly. Private, I've been in this army for 18 years, and I have never seen anything that ridiculous work that well. You just saved this battalion from taking 200 casualties crossing a minefield that should have been impassable. He paused. Captain Drummond has requested that I formally reprimand you for bypassing his authority and using unauthorized equipment. I told him to go write a report about how his proper methods would have gotten half the company killed. You're going to get a Bronze Star for this. And Drummond is going to have to live with the fact that a private with a bunch of tin cans outsmarted his West Point education. The story spread through the division within days. Other engineer units heard about Calloway's improvised mine detector and started experimenting with similar devices, dragging chains, wires with attached metal fragments, and improvised noisemakers across suspected minefields to listen for vibration changes. The method was formalized into a field expedient technique, included in engineer training, as a supplemental approach for debris-contaminated environments. By November, 3 other divisions had adopted variations of the tin can detector, and mine-clearing operations across the front became noticeably faster and safer. The German forces, interrogating captured American engineers, learned about the technique and were baffled. Their military doctrine assumed that minefields were nearly impossible to clear quickly without heavy equipment or mass artillery bombardment. The idea that American soldiers were defeating sophisticated German mine designs by dragging trash across the ground seemed absurd. Yet the evidence was undeniable. German engineers began spacing mines more irregularly and burying them deeper, but the tin can method adapted, with operators learning to recognize subtler vibration patterns and developing techniques for detecting mines at greater depths. Captain Drummond never forgave Calloway. He wrote a formal report arguing that the tin can detector was unreliable, dangerous, and contrary to established doctrine, and he recommended that its use be discontinued in favor of proper equipment operated by trained specialists. The report was filed and ignored. Drummond was transferred to a training command in England in December and spent the rest of the war teaching mine warfare to replacement troops using methods that Calloway had proven inadequate in actual combat. Sergeant Holland was killed in January 1945 during the Battle of the Bulge, cut down by machine gun fire while clearing a roadblock. Before he died, he told several soldiers about Calloway's tin cans and how a private from Kentucky had outsmarted the entire corps of engineers with childhood memories and scrap metal. Those soldiers repeated the story, and it became part of the oral history of the division, passed from veteran to replacement, embellished and altered but never forgotten. Calloway survived the war and returned to Kentucky in May 1945. He used his GI Bill benefits to study mechanical engineering at the University of Kentucky, graduated in 1949, and went to work for a manufacturing company designing agricultural equipment. He never spoke publicly about the tin can detector or the minefield at St. Marguerite. When his children asked about his war service, he said he had been an engineer, built bridges, and cleared obstacles. Nothing particularly heroic or memorable. The Bronze Star sat in a drawer, and he wore it only once, at a veterans reunion in 1962, where he met another former engineer who had used a modified version of Calloway's technique during the Rhine crossing, and wanted to thank him personally for the idea that had saved his squad. In 1973, a military historian researching improvised weapons and equipment during World War II discovered references to the tin can mine detector in division after-action reports. The historian tracked down Calloway and interviewed him about the development and use of the device. Calloway explained the concept, the childhood memory that inspired it, the resistance he faced from officers who believe in doctrine over innovation, and the successful clearing operation that proved the method worked. The historian included a brief section about the tin can detector in a book about wartime improvisation, noting that it represented a rare example of frontline soldiers' invention being rapidly adopted and potentially saving hundreds of lives. The book sold modestly and was read primarily by military historians and veterans. Calloway received a few letters from former engineers who had used variations of his technique and wanted to share their experiences. One letter came from a German veteran who had been a combat engineer on the Western Front and remembered hearing about American soldiers clearing minefields with makeshift devices that seemed impossible yet worked consistently. The German veteran wrote that he had always admired the American talent for practical improvisation, the willingness to try unconventional solutions when standard methods failed. Calloway died in 1998 at the age of 74. His obituary in the Lexington newspaper mentioned his engineering career, his family, and his military service, but said nothing about tin cans or minefields. The device he had invented existed only in scattered historical references and the fading memories of veterans who had witnessed its use. Modern mine-clearing technology had advanced far beyond improvised noisemakers, using ground-penetrating radar, robotic vehicles, and sophisticated sensors to detect buried explosives with high precision. But the principle Calloway had demonstrated remained relevant. That survival in combat often depended on seeing past official doctrine and trusting unconventional ideas that emerged from unexpected places. The minefield at St. Marguerite was cleared completely after the village was captured, engineers removing and cataloging 47 mines, 6 booby traps, and multiple wire obstacles that had been hidden across the 200-yard field. If the battalion had attempted a standard assault without Calloway's cleared path, casualty estimates suggested that between 30 and 50 men would have been killed or wounded in the first minute of the attack, potentially stalling the advance and allowing German forces to reinforce their positions. Instead, the battalion crossed with 0 casualties and captured the objective ahead of schedule, contributing to the broader Allied advance that ultimately pushed German forces back toward the Rhine. The tin cans themselves, the original string that Calloway had assembled from discarded ration containers, were lost somewhere in France, probably discarded after battle or left behind when the division moved to its next objective. No museum preserved them. No official record documented their exact construction. They existed now only as an idea, a story about a young soldier who remembered dragging a stick through creek beds and applied that childhood experience to solve a military problem that had stumped trained engineers. In the decades after the war, military institutions studied improvised mine detection methods and developed formal protocols based on lessons learned from soldiers like Callaway. The U.S. Army published field manuals describing acoustic and vibration-based detection techniques, acknowledging that unconventional approaches could be effective in specific circumstances. But the institutional memory focused on the technical principles rather than the human context, the fear and desperation that drove innovation, the mockery and resistance that improvised solutions often face before proving themselves in combat. Callaway's story survived because it captured something fundamental about warfare and human ingenuity, that the most effective solutions sometimes came from the most unlikely sources, from ordinary soldiers applying everyday experiences to extraordinary problems. He had not been a brilliant scientist or a decorated hero. He had been a farm boy from Kentucky who remembered how sticks sounded when dragged over buried objects and had the courage to suggest that the same principle might work for finding mines. That simple idea, dismissed as childish and mocked by officers who trusted equipment over intuition, had cleared a path through a killing field and allowed an entire battalion to advance safely. The broader lesson was equally important but less often remembered, that military hierarchies and institutional doctrine, while necessary for coordination and discipline, could also suppress innovation and punish unconventional thinking. Captain Drummond had rejected Callaway's idea not because it was technically unsound, but because it violated his assumptions about proper military procedure. If Lieutenant Colonel Morrison had shared Drummond's rigidity, if he had refused to let Callaway test his tin cans on the actual minefield, the battalion would have been forced to use slower conventional methods or wait for tank support that might never arrive. The willingness to listen to a private with an absurd-sounding idea had made the difference between success and failure, between 0 casualties and dozens dead. In the 21st century, as military forces continue to face improvised explosive devices and complex mine threats in combat zones around the world, Callaway's story remained relevant as a reminder that technology alone could not solve every problem. The most sophisticated mine detectors and robotic clearance systems still struggled with certain terrains and conditions, and soldiers still needed the creativity to develop field-expedient solutions when standard equipment failed. The tin can detector had been a product of its time, effective in specific circumstances of World War II battlefields, but the mindset that created it, the willingness to experiment with unconventional approaches and trust patterns that others dismissed, remained as valuable as ever. Callaway's grandchildren, learning about his wartime service decades after his death, found his Bronze Star citation in a box of old papers and asked their parents what it meant. The citation was brief and formal, stating that Private James Callaway had demonstrated exceptional initiative and technical skill in developing an innovative mine-clearing technique that enabled the successful capture of a strategic objective with minimal casualties. It said nothing about tin cans or mockery or the terror of dragging improvised equipment across an open field while machine guns fired from the darkness. Those details existed only in the oral histories and the few written accounts that historians had managed to preserve. But the essential truth remained clear. One young soldier with a childhood memory and a willingness to look foolish had created something that saved lives and changed how engineers approached an intractable problem. He had been laughed at, dismissed, and nearly prevented from trying. Yet his absurd idea had worked when conventional wisdom failed. The tin cans had rattled across a French field in October 1944, and their sound had spelled out a message that military institutions perpetually struggled to hear. That innovation came from unexpected places, that doctrine was not sacred, and that the difference between disaster and triumph sometimes hung on the question of whether commanders would trust a private with a piece of junk and the courage to use it.